Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you again for turning up this evening. For many of you, this is probably the fourth or the fifth presentation you'll listen to today. Maybe you're exhausted at this stage, if not outright punch drunk. This particular topic, who first sighted Antarctica, might sound like a real dry subject, but I'll do my best to try and make it as interesting for you as possible. Some of you might well say, who was the first who sighted Antarctica? Who cares? But believe you me, historians do care, because it matters on the record. Now, for those evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you again for turning up this evening. For many of you, this is probably the fourth or the fifth presentation you'll listen to today. Maybe you're exhausted at this stage, if not outright punch drunk. This particular topic, who first sighted Antarctica, might sound like a real dry subject, but I'll do my best to try and make it as interesting for you as possible. Some of you might well say, who was the first who sighted Antarctica? Who cares? But believe you me, historians do care, because it matters on the record. Now, for those of you who didn't hear me yesterday, my name is Joe O'Farrell. I'm from Ireland, and I'm privileged to be on this ship for the fifth consecutive year. To those of you who may be wondering why I'm in a seated capacity, it's because I've developed a neurological problem that makes it very difficult for me to stand. But the people on the ship are very accommodating, and they have no difficulty whatsoever with me delivering my presentation in a seated capacity. I hope you feel the same. So that's enough of the introduction. Now to the subject. Just to show you how large the continent of Antarctica is in relation to where we are. We are just going to be in this little small pocket of it, and yet look at the entirety. It's more than the size of Australasia. It's more than twice the size of Europe. And it really is incredible to think that this was unsighted by humans only within for the last 200 odd years. There is no other corner of the globe, of the planet, which remained unexplored, unseen, unsighted for that length of time. And yet it's amazing to think that up to 200 years ago, nobody had ever set sight on the continent of Antarctica. We'll be dealing with the years 1819, 1820. And before we go into the chief suspects as to who was the first to sight the continent, it's important just to explain that in the years after its discovery, there was frenetic activity on the continent of Antarctica. As this slide shows, there were from Britain, France, America, Ireland, Germany, there was frenetic activity on the continent once it was seen. The four claimants, or rather the three to be precise, that we'll be discussing this evening. James Cook, an Englishman in the late 1700s. You'll have heard Caroline, if you were here yesterday afternoon, you'll have heard her refer to the activities of James Cook. The three serious contenders. The first one with the rather splendid name of Fabian von Bellingshausen. He was an Estonian, a Russian, in 1819-21. Edward Mansfield was Anglo-Irish, 1820, and the American Nathaniel Palmer in 1820 and 1821. It should also be said that recorded history only records from the official logbooks. There's every possibility, in fact I would regard it almost as a certainty, that many of the whalers and the sealers from North America in the years before 1820 might well have cast their eyes on the continent of Antarctica. But such was the competitive strain that was involved in the whaling and sealing industry, that if a captain found a good rookery or a good seal colony or a good whale area, the last thing he did was broadcast it. Most times they did not even record it in the logbook. They kept the location to themselves so that their competitors could not cross the line into their territory. These are images from the time. You'll all be familiar with the stories of Moby Dick and the story of the Essex, etc. And I'm just using this for emphasis to say that the whalers from New Bedford and Nantucket in Massachusetts. Anybody here from Massachusetts? Anybody here from Connecticut? Particularly Stonington? Oh, well then you're in for a surprise. In those years, in the early 1800s, New Bedford, Nantucket, Stonington, all major whaling ports in New England sent out over 800 ships for whaling and sealing. So that's why on the balance of probability, there's every possibility that some of those ships and the captains of them would have set sight on the continent of Antarctica, but it was never recorded and therefore it's unofficial. In the Antarctic, in those days, seal pelts in particular were highly prized in Europe and America, and the sealers who did come across the colonies and clubbed the seals to extinction became very rich men from that trade. Again, the chief money to be made was the oil from the whales, but more particularly the pelts from the spur seals. You'll have heard mention yesterday of Captain James Cook. He was the first to circumnavigate the continent of Antarctica, not realizing that he had circumnavigated the continent. He was there in 1775. He felt that there was a landmass within his circle of navigation, but he could never be certain. You'll also have heard Caroline yesterday refer to his withering comment on Antarctica, if it did exist. And for those at the back of the hall, I'm happy to break my own rule and read from a slide. These are lands doomed by nature to perpetual frigidness, never to feel the warmth of the sun's rays, whose horrid and savage aspects I have not words to describe. This is the area where Captain Cook was. Now, the first of our primary contenders for the first to set sight on the continent of Antarctica is the American Nathaniel Palmer. Born in Stonington in Connecticut, he was a very, very capable seaman at a very early age. He was 20 when he commanded his first ship in Antarctic waters for whaling and sealing. There's no known early portrait of Nathaniel Palmer as a young man, but this is a daguerreotype taken of him in 1872 when he was an elderly man. This is the rotation of his voyage in his ship, the Hero, in November 1820. And this is the area of Antarctica just off the Antarctic Peninsula where we will be in a few days' time. This is the area where he did most of his sealing and whale work. He became very, very successful. He retired from seafaring at the age of only 30 and became very, very wealthy from the fur seal trade, built this very fine house in Stonington in Connecticut, which is now a museum devoted to Nathaniel Palmer. If you study the house carefully, you'll see on the top of the roof, above the third floor, the equivalent of a little lookout. He spent most of his retired life in that, as if he was on the lookout of a ship. In the museum, there are numerous displays, numerous artifacts. This shows the length of activity that there was in that area. There's a plaque beside Palmer's voyages. The plaque is worth reading. And for those again at the back of the hall, routes taken by the early Antarctic explorer Nathaniel Palmer, also Fabian Bellingshausen and Edward Bransfield. All of their voyages came close to the mainland of Antarctica, but Palmer was the first to sight this new continent in November 1820. So the Americans firmly believe that the prize of being the first to see the continent of Antarctica rests with Nathaniel Palmer. You know that you've done something serious when the nation gives a postage stamp showing your image. What is extraordinary about this is, on the basis that there is no known early portrait, sketch, let alone a photograph or a daguerreotype of Nathaniel Palmer, where did the US postal authorities get this image? Nathaniel Palmer is buried here in this cemetery in Stonington, in Connecticut. I mentioned earlier on that he retired early from his sealing and whaling work, devoted a lot of his life to what was then the emerging new skill of designing clippers. The purpose of the clipper was that it was intended to be the fastest ship on the planet, devoted exclusively to the route from what is now Ceylon, what was then Serendip, with the first of the tea crop from this season. Ceylon and Indonesia were the first countries to produce tea for export to Europe and America. Those that carried the earliest crop in the season could be guaranteed to make a small fortune. This ship here is typical of the clipper that Palmer would have been involved in the designing. You'll notice it's a 5-master. It's also very, very low on the water, which meant that it was able to take the journey from what is now Sri Lanka to the New England coast in half the time that the traditional ships took, which is why he became a very, very wealthy man. The next contender is this man, Fabian von Bellingshausen. He was born in what is now modern Estonia. He joined the Royal Navy, the Russian Navy at a very early age. Again, worked his way up through the ranks and became a sea captain at the very early age of 24, which was almost unheard of in the Russian Navy at the time. This is a contemporaneous drawing of his 2 ships, the Vostok and the Mirny, that were sent out by the Tsar of Russia to check the southern waters in the expectation and in the hope that a continent existed, which, if Russia claimed it, would be an enormous boon to Russian international prestige. I'm indebted to my fellow presenter and good friend Bob Headland, who will be lecturing again over the coming days on Antarctic history. I'm indebted to him for this fascinating slide from the Antarctic Museum in Leningrad. It purports to be a page from von Bellinghausen's logbook, and if you'll exclude all the hieroglyphics on it, this little mass was written in the logbook as intended to be the first sighting of a landmass. Now, I'm no lawyer, but you would need to be very, very astute to be able to convince a jury in a court of law that that's a landmass. In fairness to Bellingshausen, he himself never ever claimed that it was a landmass. He felt it could have been an ice blink, a mirage, even a huge iceberg, but he never himself claimed it to be the continent of Antarctica. It was his fellow shipmates who added in the logbook that this was the continent of Antarctica. Also, what's interesting from the logbook of Bellingshausen is that this is the first recorded sketch or drawing of the Aurora Australis. This was taken on February the 3rd, 1820. This square at the top of the map of Antarctica shows where Bellingshausen was on that date in February 1820, when his shipmates claimed they were first to sight the continent of Antarctica. The authorities in Russia clearly are convinced that their man was the discoverer. This is a big notice in the museum in St. Petersburg in Russia, and it reads, "Russian Antarctic expedition led by Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen and Mikhail Lazarev, discoverer of the continent of Antarctica." So again, they have nailed their colours to the mast. They firmly believe it because they erected this statue to von Bellingshausen in Kronstadt. And not unlike our good friend Palmer, the British this time issued a stamp claiming that he was deserving of recognition. Interestingly, the Russians didn't issue the stamp, it was the British. So that's von Bellinghausen's claim. And the third man to enter our story is Edward Bransfield, born around 1785. There's no record of his date of birth. The strange thing is there is no known portrait, sketch, certainly not a daguerreotype of Edward Bransfield. Nobody ever knows what he looks like, which is all the more surprising that this portrait of Edward Bransfield appeared in a 2021 book called The Antarctic Compendium, an encyclopedia for the 21st century. There is no accreditation as to where the photograph came from, and you could look at it and look at it and look at it and say that could be General Custer before the Little Bighorn. It could be Bill Cody of Buffalo Bill fame. It could even be Mark Twain. But nobody knows if it actually is Edward Bransfield. As I mentioned, he was born around 1785 in County Cork in Ireland. Now, again, to add a little bit to the history without bamboozling you with dates and years, etc., Ireland as a country was subjugated by the English for practically 800 years, from 1179 up to 1922. Britain controlled Ireland and actually subjugated it, irrespective of the local tribes who fought the British during that entire period. Around the time of the Napoleonic Wars, the early 1800s, Britain needed to expand their navy, and they consequently needed to expand the number of officers and men who could serve the ships to fight Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars. They sent impressment teams all around Ireland, and in 1803, at 18 years of age, Bransfield was out offside Ballinacurra in County Cork fishing with his father when an English patrol boat logged up beside them, took 18-year-old Edward Bransfield ashore, took him to England, and that was the end of his Irish involvement. That happened quite a lot of the time. It's reckoned that of the nearly 750,000 men who were seconded to fight in the Napoleonic Wars on England's side, or what was then Great Britain, nearly a third of them were impressed in Ireland. So it was not unusual for Edward Bransfield to be impressed into the British Navy. But probably because he had a better quality of life in England than he would have had in the rarefied rural life in Ireland, he again rose up through the ranks. He became a captain at a very early stage, and he was appointed in 1817, after the Napoleonic Wars were finished. He was appointed as the Royal Navy's Pacific Commander in Valparaiso in Chile. So in 1817 he left England, took up his new post in